Welcome back to The Explainer. Look, today we're diving straight into a really uncomfortable structural reality at the very heart of the global food crisis. We often hear about global shocks, right? Things like massive disruptions to supply chains or sudden crazy spikes in the cost of raw materials. And it's super easy to assume that these are universal problems with universal consequences. But as we're going to see today, a universal shock actually creates radically unequal outcomes. We're going to examine exactly why that happens. We have to start by shattering a massive assumption right out of the gate. When you and I read headlines about global supply closures, let's say major disruptions in critical shipping lanes like the Strait of Hormuz, the panic feels universal, doesn't it? But here is the most uncomfortable truth about the global food crisis. It won't actually touch Western dinner tables in any truly existential way. Nobody in America, Europe, or Australia is going to go hungry because of these macro-level supply closures. Sure, a loaf of bread might cost a bit more, chicken might get pricier, but the developing world, they face catastrophic, structural starvation. Okay, so let's dive into this. This right here is the central question that's going to guide our whole analysis today. Why does the exact same global crisis, literally the exact same disruption of inputs, create completely different outcomes depending entirely on where you're standing on the map? If the crisis is universal, why is the suffering so localized? Well, we need to look under the hood at the actual mechanics of who starves, who survives, and why.
Section 1, the uncomfortable truth.
Let's break down the actual mechanics of a universal fertilizer and input disruption, and how it translates into these vastly different daily realities. When the catalyst hits, meaning a massive shock to fertilizer and other agricultural inputs, wealthy nations just experience it as inflation. The impact is purely economic. It's measured in slightly pricier groceries, and the consumer essentially absorbs the hit at the checkout counter. But in the developing world, the impact isn't just economic, it's physiological. The result isn't inflation, it is structural starvation. It's a fundamental breakdown of the very ability to grow enough calories to keep a population alive.
Section 2, a tale of two farms.
To really wrap our heads around this structural divergence, we have to zoom out from the macroeconomics and look at the vastly different starting lines of two specific farming realities. Just look at the immense contrast in resource access here. On one side, you've got a typical U.S. commercial farm. It's highly mechanized. If an input shock hits, well, they have deep access to credit lines to weather the storm, they have crop insurance to mitigate the risk, and they operate beneath this massive umbrella of government subsidies. Now, on the flip side, you have an African smallholder plot. We're talking about a farmer working maybe 1 to 3 hectares of land, bringing in a total income of just $1,000 to $2,000 a year. There are zero safety nets here, no crop insurance, no credit access, and they're operating in countries where the governments are already way too fiscally constrained to offer any meaningful subsidies. The starting line isn't just uneven, it's practically in two completely different universes. And this disparity, it's literally staggering when you look at the baseline fertilizer application rates. The United States applies approximately 140 kilograms of fertilizer per hectare. Sub-Saharan Africa applies a mere 18. 18! That is the baseline. Before a crisis even hits, the smallholder plot is operating on razor-thin margins of soil nutrition compared to the heavily fortified commercial farms in the West.
Section 3, the fertilizer price shock. So what actually happens when a massive global cost spike slams into these two drastically different sets of agricultural resources? Well, when fertilizer costs spike, say by a massive 40%, wealthy country farmers simply leverage those financial cushions we just talked about. Their operations are large-scale, they just tap into their credit to pay the higher upfront costs for the inputs. And because they can do that, they maintain their 140 kilogram application rates. Because they maintain those rates, they preserve their long-term crop yields. Ultimately, they just pass those higher input costs right down the supply chain to a consumer base that, yeah, it might grumble about inflation, but can generally afford to pay it. The farm survives and the long-term yield is totally protected.
But then, we look at the developing world and we slam into this devastating number, 25%. This represents the sudden, sheer drop in African fertilizer application following the supply shock out of Ukraine. Think about it. When you're already applying just 18 kilograms per hectare, a 25% reduction isn't just tightening your belt. It's an absolute catastrophic loss of nutrients that fundamentally cripples long-term crop yields. So the absolutely crucial point here is that the smallholder farmer does not have the luxury of absorbing the cost. They face a terrifying, totally binary choice. Option A, try to buy fertilizer at prices that vastly exceed their $1,000 to $2,000 annual income, which, remember, is impossible without credit. Or option B, skip the fertilizer entirely and accept yield losses that they simply cannot survive. Without safety nets, a cost increase isn't just an inconvenience, it's a forced reduction in output that leads directly to starvation.
Section 4. Markets working as designed. Now, it is super tempting to look at this horrifying divergence in agricultural outcomes and just call it a broken system. But we need to be strictly analytical here. This is not a glitch in the market. What we are witnessing is a deeply embedded systemic imbalance. Markets are designed for efficiency, right? They aren't designed to solve structural inequality. They operate strictly based on purchasing power. That means the farmer with credit survives, while the farmer living on $1,000 a year is left totally exposed. When a shock happens and fertilizer becomes scarce, the global market does exactly what it was built to do. It allocates that scarce resource to the highest bidder. And because of those massive structural advantages we outlined earlier, the highest bidder is always the wealthy Western farmer. They get the fertilizer. Their yields are maintained. The casualty of this perfect market efficiency is always the developing world smallholder, who is basically instantly priced out of existence.
Section 5. The two-tier food system.
And this brings us to the inevitable, macro-level conclusion of everything we've looked at today. We aren't just looking at a temporary crisis here. We are looking at the cementing of a deeply divided two-tier global food supply. When we map these divergent realities side by side, the outcome is stark. For wealthy nations, financial absorption leads directly to maintained long-term yields. For poor nations, a lack of purchasing power leads to total long-term yield collapse. You have the exact same universal fertilizer price affecting both systems. It's the same shock, the same market, but entirely different realities. And we absolutely have to recognize the long-term trajectory here. This gap between the industrial farm and the subsistence plot, it isn't closing. With each new global disruption, with each subsequent crisis, the heavily cushioned systems secure the resources they need to keep going, while the vulnerable systems are stripped of the few resources they even had left. These two agricultural tiers are just being pushed further and further apart.
Which really brings us to this powerful thought derived from our analysis today. The world's food system doesn't fail equally. It fails the poorest first, hardest, and longest. This perfectly encapsulates the brutal reality of the industrial versus subsistence divide. One system is built to absorb crises financially, while the other is tragically forced to absorb them nutritionally.
So I want to leave you with a final, somewhat provocative thought to chew on. If our global food markets are functioning with perfect efficiency, yet the guaranteed outcome is long-term yield collapse for the most vulnerable producers, what does that actually mean for the future stability of the global food supply? I'd really love to hear your take on this, so definitely drop your thoughts in the comments. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Be sure to subscribe because next time we are diving into the looming invisible crisis of soil nutrient debt. It's a fascinating one. I'll see you there.